Everybody for coming. This should be a great panel. We're here to talk about how to tell the difference between truth and falsehood, the whole idea of fake news, what it's like to be the enemy of the public, and how that's changed your job. So we have Ana Cabrera, who I think probably needs very little introduction, but she's a Murrow grad. That's what you need to know. And we're very, very proud of her. She had degrees in communication and foreign languages, and currently headquartered in New York. You've made the move. She's anchoring primetime evening news on weekends, CNN Newsroom. Before that, she was in Denver and covered the horrible 2013 floods, the fires that were happening at that time, won an Emmy for that at KMGH. And back to her life at WSU, she ran track and cross country for us as a scholarship athlete, so lots of skill sets to share with all of us. Mark Wright, next to my left, is a 1989 graduate of the Murrow College of Communication. Got his start in public radio, probably KWSU, AM. And we had a little closer relationship with students actually running, and Glenn was probably making sure all of that happened at the time.
We had a news director who was it was an independent staff, a paid staff but we staffed the newsroom with us.
Yeah.
So rookies were the reporters. It was a wonderful upbringing as a journalist, a good foundation.
And radio is a great way to learn to do news quickly without all the equipment of TV. Turn it around quickly and be up to date. And finally, Russ Walker, who is assistant news director at King 5, and he comes from a less traditional path. He was a print journalist writing for Politico and a lot of high-powered East Coast publications. So those of you who are taking Ben Shore's class as well as taking TV news classes, I think you're on the right path, learning the best of both. So let me just throw out the first question. I really, really want you to ask questions. I know the panel wants to hear what you have to say. But let me just start by saying, how can we, as journalists, sort of use understanding of issues as a way of bridging the partisan divide, instead of getting into a battle of catchphrases or talking points? How do we somehow find a common understanding? Because I think if we learned anything from the past election is two sides of the country did not understand each other very well, and we continue. So how do you do that as a journalist? How do you use news to produce understanding instead of just reinforcing partisan division?
Take a crack at that since
I'll let Russ
you
take a
work
crack
for the
at
fake
it.
news channel. I'm sorry. Russ and I were going to have a skit where he was going to actually interrupt the luncheon by yelling "fake news, fake news." He was going to do it, but we decided that probably wouldn't be such a no high fives. Let's let you take the
No, you just earned that start.
Go ahead.
Okay,
Go first, Mark.
Okay, now that I've derailed the entire conversation. I think the thing that I think is the most challenging at this point is that I don't think what traditional media have done has changed at all. I think we've always been committed to the truth, and we've been committed to trying to be fair. I think the problem is that we've seen a seismic shift in how people perceive the truth and where they get their information that they perceive as the truth. And I think that's having the most profound impact on what we do as journalists, because we've not changed our commitment. There have been evolutions of Fox News clearly has an agenda. Some say MSNBC has an agenda. But I think for us, and CNN I think has always been straight down the middle. But for us, the real challenge now is we have people that don't really care about the facts. So the debate on global warming is not a debate.
No.
If you're a scientist. It's not a debate. It's scientifically true if you believe in science, which, I mean, I hope we all do, because everything that we do in our lives, this microphone, this computer, our cars, it's all based on the same thing about how we arrived at that truth. I think that's the biggest thing that maybe you guys can jump in and talk about we've become so isolated. Edelman does a trust survey. You guys familiar with Edelman, the big PR firm? Every year they do a really cool survey on trust in America, and they survey people on their perceptions of the major institutions. So you've got government and media and NGOs. Journalism is at an all-time low just about for when it comes to trust. People trust companies more than they trust the media now, and they trust their friends even more than that. So think about that as people are engaging in Facebook and all those other things. They would much rather hear from their friend to get the news. And as you said in your presentation, we don't often know where the original story came from. So.
And that matters. Russ, you want to go next?
I mean, I'll just say that we're at a point where an issue like global warming is seen. If you say that word, then you're automatically an environmental radical who wants to seize control of everyone's cars and make them use low flush toilets and things like that. But the biggest challenge we have is explaining what reality is. And it's hard. With politics, it's hard. It's hard to understand what's happening inside the White House at any given moment because there's so many people who work there and they're all leaking their own version of the facts. But I think the media can do a better job. Our newsroom, where Mark and I work, could do a better job of laying out things that are the bulwark of reality. And so around climate change, we tell a lot of stories about how the Puget Sound is changing because the chemistry of the ocean is changing. We're telling a lot of stories about renewable energy because Seattle area is a hotbed for that kind of technology. I'm not sure that it changes very many minds, but it is a role that we can get into where we're not just reporting, oh, this politician wants to do this versus this politician who wants to do that. I have a lot of feelings about climate change. I used to cover the issue very closely. In my opinion, there is a conservative argument a conservative approach to addressing climate change, and it would be great to see that argument articulated better by the media, but also understood by people who don't necessarily trust the science of climate change. But that's a whole other side.
I'm going to take a crack at this from a little bit different angle, and that is, I think, the facts are the facts, but people experience life differently, and so people may interpret certain situations or experiences in different ways that creates a different perception. And I think one of the things that is important for us as journalists to do is to shed light on what that experience is like for this person who may be a farmer in Wisconsin compared to what life is like and the experiences on a daily basis for somebody who is a financier and works on Wall Street. And, their worlds are very different, even though they're still part of the United States. And I think that's, one thing we saw in terms of the division within the country during the election cycle is some of those who may have been, in places that aren't out there in your face felt like they weren't represented so well and haven't had their needs met or heard. And so I think as a journalist, it's really important to seek out those different voices and to be able to share those to, sometimes, one of the reasons or the complaints of those who feel like they have been oppressed in their situations or haven't been given a fair shake at life is because, they haven't been given a platform or an opportunity to have their voices heard. They don't have access to it. And so, we as journalists have a responsibility to make sure that some of their stories get out there. And I think that helps to create an understanding that bridges the gap.
Correct. I mean, in the case of climate change, there are valid concerns about the implications of regulation that would address climate change. If you're from an energy-rich state like Oklahoma, you have concerns about jobs. So why can't the debate not be about my facts versus your facts, but about implications and alternative policies that might address some of those implications that might negatively affect jobs in one state? Why does it have to be about my facts are right and your facts are wrong. Let's find out what's beneath this opposition to, acknowledging climate change. And with a network like CNN, you have the country at your disposal, but for a local station, how do you, I guess do you consider yourself a statewide station? That you can, regional, but so you have the ability to find pockets of concern and ways of expressing those concerns too, I would think.
Yeah, I think it goes back to, what Russ was saying, that, I mean, if we just keep doing what we're doing, and people keep isolating themselves when it comes to where they get their information, we're really not going to have much of an impact, and I just don't really see a fix to this whole problem. I think we have to shine light on what's driving this. And if you look at, I mean, there was a great article in the Seattle Times recently. There's a UW professor doing some great research about, there was these conspiracy theories would pop up on the internet. So like after the Boston Marathon bombing, they just saw this surge of false reports that the U.S. military may have been behind that, or and 9/11, and all these conspiracies. So she actually did a study on this, and there's a guy named Alex Jones who has a website called InfoWars. The president has cited him as being a credible, good source of information. This is the guy that has suggested 9/11 was a conspiracy that our government did to us. The president is calling him a good source of information. So InfoWars is one of the websites that gets spun by these bots with these fake stories. So after something happens, boom, this picks it up, that picks it up, all these same sites start hitting, social media starts hitting. Pretty soon you have this explosion of a fake news story that suddenly is now out there. And it really doesn't matter what happens after that, because it's had its initial impact on people who have a perception of this information. The damage has been done. So the system essentially has been hijacked by these infobots and by these websites that have one agenda, and that is to spin the news. And if you want to be honest about it, that's the real fake news. And they're not just...
It's not even just spin.
Yeah, no, it's blatantly false. And that's being not only quoted by the White House, it's being propagated by a massive number of computers around the world. So that's what we're up against when it comes to these stories. And throughout this last election cycle, maybe you can talk about it, Russ, there were some horrible conspiracy stories about Hillary Clinton and that got out there and just blew up. And in the old days, that never would have happened. But the technology of today is such that it gets out and it has a huge impact right away. And I think if we don't figure out how to educate people about that, I just don't see how the current system is going to change.
And I would just say that the more things change, the more they stay the same. The conspiracies about Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton were just as intense in the 90s before the internet became the resource that it is now. They were just as vitriolic and just as insane, and it got around through talk radio. The conservative talk radio and some, but not all, religious talk radio really spread a lot of that stuff. It goes back to John McCain in the year 2000 in South Carolina. There was a rumor spread deliberately by the Bush campaign that John McCain had an illegitimate black daughter. The fact is he has an adopted daughter from Sri Lanka. So I don't know why that would matter, but it did apparently get spread around, and it was one reason why John McCain took a long time before he would speak to George W. Bush again. I guess what I would say is that the technology that's out there that propagates this misinformation or these outright lies so quickly is what's really new. That the random rant of Alex Jones can end up in every computer in the country within a matter of an hour or less. That's scary, but it's not new. There's always been rumor mongering and fake news out there, but the media is not right now equipped to respond to it as well as it should be. We're learning on the job.
Sure.
So, we as journalists, you're saying that we've lost the trust of the people, or at least the majority. And so if the president can easily say that even if our reports are credible and our facts are checked, he could say that it's fake news, and a lot of the country, millions of people will agree with him. So what should we do as journalists, whether it's your generation or our new coming out of college, what should we do to fight that?
I think there are people who you're not going to change their mind. There are people who believe what they want to believe, and if they find a source of information that backs that up, it's not those people who you're trying to necessarily change their minds or get to. I think it goes back to, who is your audience and what is the purpose of what we're doing. And so that's kind of what drives me, I think, is, I want to have the impact, but if you just cower away from that, it's not about, coming and going head to head. It's, again, going back to picking apart what isn't true and making sure that what is true gets out there. And I think it goes back to then, as journalists, being a good storyteller so that you can, really sell your message, the message of what is true and what the facts are. And for people to want to pay attention, you have to show that, one, you're with it in terms of understanding what some of the fear or concerns that may be, leading to these fake news stories, or why people want to believe this other source of information that isn't credible. I think that's part of incorporating an understanding of that in your reporting will help to chip away at those organizations that are trying to undermine the real work that we're doing.
I agree. I think it comes back to, we have to just redouble our efforts and recommit to truth and fairness. And I think there has been sort of a gut reaction among some news organizations to smash back. When there's been this outrageous claim over here, they attack back and almost just get into this. What's really important, though, is that we as journalists, we can't get into the fight of it. We just have to try to find out what the best information is. And like I said during the luncheon, if the current administration, our job isn't to judge. If they are doing something that they should get credit for, according to some people, we have to fairly cover. If we start taking a position, sort of an anti-position against the people who are doing this stuff, then it just is going to get worse, because you're going to have misinformation here, bias here, and it's never going to resolve. But if we come at misinformation with truth, like Ed Murrow, that's the antidote to that. But we got to be really sure and do a gut check that we don't have biases that are tainting how we are, engaging with that other group.
Yeah, I think that in a lot of ways, the best ways to combat this is for you guys to do your jobs fairly and with humanity. If you go out and help a family fight off a bank that was trying to foreclose illegally on their home, and you do it by exposing the wrongdoings of the bank, and you report the facts fairly and accurately, you're going to win over someone's heart. But even if you just go and cover someone's 100th birthday and talk about their life, and maybe they were a veteran of World War II or once played minor league baseball, just told a really good story about them, they're gonna see you as not the enemy. I think a lot of people sit at home or sit within their networks, either online or in the physical world, and they're not exposed to individuals, reporters as humans, or people who may not come from their background as humans. And we need to be able to recognize that there's some valid resentment out there. A lot of people, if all you did all day was watch Fox News, you'd be pretty resentful. Or if all you did was watch MSNBC, you might be pretty resentful of what you see. But so I don't know. I'm trying to answer a too big of a question, but I think that in a lot of ways, the elites of the country may have failed to deliver on the promises of what America is supposed to be. And there's a lot of anger out there, and that anger is getting swept up by a lot of emotional things triggered by fake news, but also real news. So.
You know, I think one thing that is really good, the impact in terms of the environment that we are in, with all of these falsehoods versus what's true, and how do you sort through all of it. For me as a journalist, it's made me reflect more on the work that I do, and I think that's a really healthy thing for what's happening right now in journalism. It's made us kind of scrutinize ourselves and go back to, you know, those basics of, you know, what should journalism be about, and to have to reflect on that. And I know, you know, there's a lot of introspection among my colleagues too, of, you know, making sure, doubling down to do our jobs right, so that people can't point the finger and say, that's exactly why I don't, you know, trust media. Like, it's making us be better journalists.
I think it's also possible to find stories that, you know, might run on Fox News, but that are still human interest stories about overreach of government, you know, burdensome regulation that affect local businesses. I think those can be done with humanity and truth.
And fairness.
And fairness,
Yeah, I think that's the key, is that if we do our jobs and accurately paint a picture of reality in our society, I think that's our highest calling, because then the public can decide if the policy that resulted in this is good or bad. If we talk about home foreclosures, or people losing health insurance, or people getting health insurance, if we just do a good job of explaining what's happening, then people can make their own mind up as to whether what caused it, or what they believe caused it, was good or bad. Does that make sense? Because it's not our job to say this policy is bad because it hurt this family. We should just say this is the family story, and then tell it in its proper context.
Please, in the back.
So I suppose this is kind of like a similar question, but I ran into multiple cases of where I'm trying to have like a factual conversation with someone, and they just write me off as a college student who is attending a university, and I've been brainwashed because all universities are. It's just very frustrating because you're getting an education, I'm doing my research. How would we combat that?
I'm not, you know, there's people out there that you're never going to be able to convince. We get calls, I get emails and calls in our newsroom, people very upset with us. I think the most important thing is to be respectful of these people, but also not sort of rise to the bait. You can't get angry at them for insisting that the government's poisoning us with chemtrails in the sky. I mean, it's just, you're not going to win that argument with someone who's convinced that that's the facts. I think all I would say is, like, don't rise to the bait and keep the lines of communication open, because the more they see you as someone who respects them and will engage with them, the more you might have an opportunity down the line to show them, like, you know what, this fact that you're so convinced of is actually not a fact.
And I think be open-minded too in terms of hearing different sides, because people do have different opinions, and that's okay. I still think the facts are the facts, and so that's another way to combat that, because I think I face that sometimes too when, you know, I'm doing my job and I want to make sure that there are messages that aren't coming through our airwaves that are not factually true, and so you really do have to know what the facts are. And when it comes to pushing back on those, it's doing your homework and saying, okay, I hear what you're saying. Where did you get that information? It's asking them questions about where they're coming from to try to get a better understanding from them. But in the same time, it's having an impact on maybe making them also think about where they're getting their information, which is helping to start chipping away at, you know, people just throwing what they hear from Joe Schmo and believing it and taking it as fact. So by asking them for that, asking that question, where did you hear that? Where did you learn that? Or what's the evidence for that? And in a way that's not defensive, that might be one way to approach it.
I have one more thing I just wanted to throw in. If you guys wanted to write down, I listened to a TED Talk a while back that was really brilliant on this topic. The speaker is a guy named Rob Willer. ROBB, sorry, my eyes are bad, WILLER. It's called How to Have Better Political Conversations. And essentially hit what Russ was talking about. If you come to the table with a respect for a person that you disagree with, it completely changes the tone. But he goes a step further, and he examines the values that those people hold. So once you understand the values that they find most important, then you can structure your conversation to them in a way that resonates with those values that they hold dear. So it's a very smart TED Talk, and if you want to have just better conversations with people like that, but it starts with respect, and it continues with a true understanding of what motivates those people. Because if you think about it, a lot of the similar things, similar thinking is at work in religious communities in America. Some of the same drivers are at work there. And who are we to say someone's right or wrong? But this is what people believe. But once we understand sort of what their mindset is, we can engage in a respectful way that's going to have a much better outcome than two people saying, you're stupid, no, you're stupid.
So I think the key here is listening, too, and reflective listening, getting to what their concern really is, not so much the talking points, not so much what they've read and what you've read, but what's the real concern here? And if you don't have a comeback, then maybe that's fine. You know, you've learned something about their position. Let me just. There's a question here.
I have a question. Say, I'd like to hear a couple of comments concerning the media and pursuing the truth concerning weapons of mass destruction. That I think pretty much the whole nation thought that there were weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East, but it's resulted in a war that we've been in ever since.
Were you in D.C. at the time?
I mean, there have been whole books written on this.
How much time do you guys have?
You guys take over. I was still told that.
I think we were all there. We saw what happened. The whole country got swept up into a frenzy, and 9/11 was the trigger. And, there are probably people in this room who might have a very different viewpoint on what has been going on in the Middle East.
Wasn't that feeding the news something that the news couldn't discover or investigate? Or how did that happen?
Again, there have been a lot of books written about this. Yes, they were very artful in how they manipulated some reporters. The White House didn't know as much. They were operating with bad information. But there was a deliberate effort to scare us into going to war with Iraq. And Saddam Hussein was the perfect villain. No one should feel bad that that guy's gone. So
I think at the heart of what happened there is at the heart of what happens anytime there's sort of a fear and hysteria. Human beings, our brains just get hijacked by fear because our ancestors made sure that we were here because they had a good fear response. I mean, it's a healthy thing. It's kept us alive. But it's also hijacked us. If you look at the worst periods of human history, a lot of it is based on fear of other people, fear of other cultures, fear of terrorism, fear of this, fear of religion. We're at our worst as human beings when we get afraid. I remember being a little radio reporter at KBSU in Boise. That was my first job, was a legislative reporter. And when you sit on the floor of a legislature and you watch debate and then you watch how votes go, it's really interesting how bills get torpedoed when someone just throws a little something in there that is like, ooh, I don't know if we thought about that. I feel a little bit uneasy about that. Throw a little bit of fear into the conversation about the what if. And I saw so many bills just go down. You could just see just go down because of the use of fear. As journalists, go back. If you guys haven't read any really good biographies of Edward R. Murrow, I recommend. The dynamic that he went through in the 50s with the McCarthy hearings is exactly what we're doing today. And when you look at the worst public policy, it's driven by fear. When you look at the worst military operations, they're driven by fear. So fear makes us do bad things, but we as journalists have to not get swept up in that fear and just, again, point people back to what we know are the facts.
I would just add, just briefly, and I'm not the expert on the panel, but let me just say that my understanding of the going to war based on faulty evidence, we did have good evidence. What we didn't have was respect for the nonpartisan analysts who provided the evidence. We had a political person in the room, National Security Council, that was spinning the evidence and editing and asking for a revision of reports showing no evidence. And so I guess that brings my question of how do we deal with this issue in which everybody is assumed to be biased, but the fact is we have nonpartisan experts seated throughout government, like the Congressional Budget Office, who tell us, no, this bill is going to cost a lot of people their health insurance. How do we build respect for our experts in a society in which everybody is assumed to be suspects, particularly somebody with the name congressional in their title?
But not all experts are right.
Yeah.
And they're not all trustworthy. They
But-
need to be challenged, even those institutions that we hold, for lack of a better word, sacred, like the Bureau of Labor Statistics or the Congressional Budget Office. They're not necessarily, their view of the universe isn't necessarily as accurate as they would like us to believe. I'm not saying that the CBO is wrong about how they scored the health reform bill, but we're all humans, and economics especially is a dismal science, is how it's described by the people who practice it. It's not an empirical science. You can't say that 2 + 2 = 4 in economics, because there's that human element that just blows everything up. I mean, I remember the 90s when they said that the economic boom that was happening at that point in our country was going to go on forever because we had fixed the problem of inflation and unemployment. And, Alan Greenspan was held up as the greatest man on earth. And then there was the dot-com crash, and then there was the big crash in 2007, 2008. We just have to challenge the experts, but we have to respect them when they are challenged and they explain their work. Then maybe that there's a way that maybe that helps them be more accountable to us, to be even more factually accurate.
Yeah, I think it goes back to asking probing questions, not just taking the first answer as the end all. That's part of it. I also think it goes back to having looking at the breadth of information that's out there in terms of being able to provide some perspective around statistics and going back to, how credible is the source. And sometimes it's cross-checking, it's seeing if other experts in the field come up with the same result. Going back to the climate change example, it's now a fact that climate change is happening. It's not because I say it is, it's because 97% of climate scientists who have studied this for their career say it's happening, and they have the evidence to back it up, and it's that breadth of information and evidence that shows that that is the truth. And so I think that's, it can be applied in different scenarios, but it helps if you can have multiple sources that are credible sources that are giving the same kind of information.
Yeah, I think Anna hit it right on the head. One of the biggest things I learned once I started working as a reporter is that when you first start out, you kind of have this idea that there are two sides to every story. And there are some stories with maybe 5 sides. And so your job as a journalist isn't just to take what one person says and then go find somebody who doesn't agree with that, because that may be, you're not really bringing it up to the level of knowledge that it should be in terms of truth. News is about perspective. It's just about life. So finding as many sources as you can to give their perspective, and at the end of the day, it's a judgment call. And there's a lot of gray out there. So just be open to the idea that it's not always this person said this and this person said that.
But so to play off of that idea, with staying in climate change, right? So 97% of climate scientists say one thing, but there's flat earthers and there's others. So is it fair or accurate journalism to give them credit,
Right.
to add their perspective?
No.
Is that helping us
No.
or harming us?
I think it's harming because you don't want to be fueling falsehoods, right? So to me, it goes back to saying this is what the scientific community has concluded. That is fair.
Russ?
We have this argument every time a climate change story comes up in our news meeting. And I always get incensed and I go on my tirade. And the tirade is, it's settled fact. If you think that the answer to climate change is to do nothing, that's fine. That's a valid response. But operate within the reality that it is happening. If you think that climate change can only be fixed by converting to nuclear energy, that's a discussion we can have, and we can get people going on both sides of that. But we're not going to put flat earthers on our air unless we're doing a story about a phenomenon called flat earthers, in which we're going to make clear these people are not telling the truth. Either they know it or they are misled and gullible. But it is not the truth. But they're out there and they're causing a lot of harm.
I think we've seen, I love your question, by the way, because we've seen similar issues come up in the reporting of vaccines and the safety of vaccines in America. There's no evidence that vaccines cause things like Down syndrome or autism, yeah. But I mean, I know exactly what you're talking about, because I have heard over the years, time and time again, outrageous claim, but so-and-so denies it. Or fact, but so-and-so says that's not really true. And the journalist feels like they're balancing the story when all they're doing is what Russ said, is give the person with an unrealistic,
And it's
not
just, it's
factual
our
view.
nature as journalists to try to get two sides to everything. And there, in a lot of the world, a lot of reality, there are two sides, particularly on political issues like how do you structure your healthcare system. But I tell you, it comes up in our newsroom all the time because we're so ingrained about getting both sides, and we want to have this sense of balance. But you can't have balance about empirical fact. And that's my mantra when I'm in the news meeting, and I still feel like I have to make that case every time it comes up. And frankly, if I'm not there, I worry. I worry that they're going to go out and find someone from what is it? It's not the Heritage, the Heartland Institute, which is the climate denial think tank, and get a quote from them and put it in one of our stories. And I'm going to pull my hair out and yell and scream, and probably have to do it again a week later.
Now, there are a lot of issues, though, in which people don't agree. There aren't, it's not so black and white. And so I think that's when it is really important to be able to kind of peel back the onion and show the complexity of certain things. And you'd never want to go out on a story and think, this is all I need. I need a voice for this, I need a voice for that. I think you need to stay open-minded about where the story goes, where the evidence goes, where, so-and-so might say one thing that all of a sudden triggers another idea in your mind. And again, you want to have as complete of a picture of what it is that you're trying to communicate. And so it's important to stay open-minded and not just assume you know what the answer is.
Please.
So I've got to intern at a news station during election season and during times where protests were happening and police brutality issues were up in the media, and it was almost, and well, in my opinion, the media was covering these communities on a national level where it was all destruction, and then these conversations come up where, oh, this movement, I'll say it like Black Lives Matter movement, these people are savages, these people are dangerous. How do you respond to that, and is there ever a point where you say, no, we're gonna stop covering and we're gonna take a different angle on how to portray a movement or political issues that are going on?
I think it goes back to what we were talking about. At some point, there's a judgment call as to whether our audience needs to know about either an event or needs to know the opinion of this group. And that's a judgment call. I mean, it's TV sometimes, and I think rightfully so, is accused of creating a false reality of a more violent, more conflict-filled world than it actually happens. It really does concentrate reality. if we covered every plane that landed safely, it would be a very boring newscast. So it's the nature of the business to point out what has not gone right that day. But I think at some point, it's a judgment call, and you just have to, I mean, if it has enough inertia, you have to give it voice. But some people, and we know in Seattle is the protest capital of the world, there are some people that will protest anything, and a lot of these people have no vested interest in the topic of the day. They're just anarchists looking to cause trouble, and they just jump out whenever they see the opportunity.
Yeah.
I don't know, do you have anything to add on that?
I mean, a TV camera draws attention, and sometimes things will happen around TV cameras that wouldn't have happened unless we were there. And so we're having a very serious debate in our newsroom right now about May Day. May Day every year in Seattle is a protest day. Every year there is a large peaceful march, usually of groups from like the Unity and African American and the Latino groups do it's a very great march, lots of speeches, and we cover that. And then there's these 50 anarchists who show up in all black, usually carrying wooden dowels, and they deliberately stage vandalism and throw things at the police. They do it, and we're starting to ask ourselves, why are we broadcasting this every year? It happens every year, and we're having very serious talks now, like not putting any reporters on the ground in there. Cover the peaceful marches, cover the regular speech making, but we're not going to cover 50 people, and they're all different. They're anarchists, so it's hard to classify them or even describe them, other than that they're basically creating destruction for the purpose of destruction, and our role shouldn't be to give them a platform for that. So.
Right. Did that answer your question, or were you trying to ask something a little bit different? Did we get to it?
I think I was trying to ask something different. How do you respond to people who say that you guys only cover news, you guys only give a voice to the people who are just creating destruction in their communities?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know what that answer is exactly, but I can think of a scenario in which, we were covering a protest that turned violent, for example. I spent a lot of time in Ferguson, Missouri, after the Michael Brown shooting that, seemed to be a real trigger for a movement within the country and shed some light on dynamics that were happening in different pockets and different communities all over the country. And I think it went back to, again, going back to finding what the facts were of the situation. And that situation was really complex in that it wasn't just about what happened to Michael Brown and what the facts of that investigation would reveal, but what that exposed, that scenario, it was like ripping off a Band-Aid that was covering a wound that was gushing, that spoke to some dynamics within the community that were happening, that were below the surface that nobody realized maybe, and especially an outsider looking in. And so that outrage that was being expressed was worthy of news coverage because it was more about that emotion was a result of these pieces that were happening in the community, the socioeconomic disparity, the oppression of people of color that was happening. I mean, and it's not me editorializing that, that's what we were hearing. So I should, attribute that to what people in that community were telling us. But then you also go back to looking at some of like the judicial statistics that are within that community that help to back up the story and back up that perspective. When it came to traffic stops, disproportionately people of color were being stopped and arrested, and then, you cover, if you follow where the facts are and you decide whether, that story is an accurate portrayal that so-and-so is telling you. But I think that's how, in part, is how we make decisions about whether to cover some of those stories. And then on the flip side, police in this country, feel like, well, then you're demonizing police. Well, that's not what we're trying to do either. And so it's important, too, to hear that side and to ask the police officers too in those situations. If somebody says, well, the police treat us this way, I don't just take what they say and run with that. Then we go to the police and we say, did you know that, this is what we were told by so-and-so, what's your response? How do you handle a situation like this? And we try to incorporate their voices and their opinions and their feelings and, give the complete story that way so that it isn't just covering the loudest voice.
And I think the thing that happened in that case was the Department of Justice eventually investigated, and again, shout out for respect for authorities. They found patterns of abuse and racism within the police department, cases of implicit bias, and they set out a set of steps to remedy this situation. So yeah, it was justified, and they've been in other cities as well. Pasco had the same investigation. Let me just go to the gentleman in the middle who had a question a while ago.
Yeah, so thinking about, talking about credibility of sources and the idea that, after a while you don't want to give someone a vehicle to which to speak to. I mean, how do you guys balance that with the idea that, there are certain people that are high enough in positions of power that are going to find that vehicle otherwise? I mean, guys like Sean Spicer, the president, Kellyanne Conway, people that we, in different times, have shown to be not credible. How do you guys balance the idea of giving them somewhere to talk, but also almost reining them in so that they don't go outside of the traditional outlets to try to spread the message without anyone to check them?
It's, our country's interesting in that if you get elected to public office, you have a platform. And it's an obligation, I think, of the media to listen to the people who have been elected by the people. That's a fundamental part of our society. Sometimes people get elected and some people don't like who got elected. I think it just goes back to, you have to just go back to the evidence. You have to go back to the facts, have to go back to the truth, so that even if someone is elected, you just don't give them the microphone and let them spout off. You do your job as a journalist and challenge what they say, check it, verify it, ask somebody else. So it's tough though, because I mean, that's just kind of the reality of our country.
So my question is actually very similar, but just your thoughts on the term alternative facts, because Kellyanne Conway, she does now have this platform and they're using it. It's fact checking, but now, just your personal opinion on
I mean, it's holding their feet to the fire. It's like, they can call it what they want, but what are the facts? Asking the question, where is that evidence? And if they're saying something that isn't true, it's saying that isn't true, because here's what the evidence shows. Here is what actually happened. Here's the tape of what was said. So that's how you combat that, I think, and try to prevent that from spreading as a fact that's not true. It's difficult. It's challenging. It's not easy, that's for sure. But it also, I think it goes back to it's a challenge as a journalist, but it also makes our jobs that much more relevant and more important and more interesting and more engaging. It's given, even more fuel to the fire of what we do.
And CNN ratings are not doing too bad either as a result of this.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, question.
So with social media, fake news articles are everywhere now, and as was said at the lunch, even many young people can't distinguish the difference between what's true and what's not. So how do we get people on social media specifically, because it's so big now, to read and follow the truthful news and overshadow the fake?
It's a great question.
That's a hard question to answer.
It's a great question. I think part of every time I find myself ranting about stuff, I have to introspect and say, wow, there's some of this in me. I think all of you in the room and all of us here, we have to examine our own biases. And we have to be really honest about it. We all have biases, if we're honest. But let's figure out what those are, and let's be aware of them so that they don't taint our ability to do our jobs. I think if everybody in America did that, it would be a very different country. But I think people go like this. It's very difficult. All social media does is amplify the natural connections between human beings. Back in the old days before computers, I could go up to you and say, hey, you know what? I saw Anna. She did something terrible, and let me tell you about it. And I would spread this to you, and you might tell a friend, and it just kind of went like that. And you didn't know where I got my information. I may have overheard it. But it's the same dynamic. Just the difference now is that we have billions of people who are connected within a millisecond of this information. So managing that once it gets out is impossible. All we can do is go back to our best shot at what the evidence is. But it's such a different dynamic now that it's so fast and global. And it makes you wonder, like the next big, financial crisis. I mean, we're vulnerable, more vulnerable now to things, military threats, financial crises, stock market crashes, all that stuff that's magnified because we are just right next to each other. So I don't know if that answered your question, but it's tough.
Just remember that we're humans, and we live in a human reality, and we're all flawed in our own ways. And how we perceive this, if we all left this room and we were asked to all say what color the carpet was or the wall is, we might not get the right answer from everyone. I think the one thing I've learned as being a journalist is that every person has a voice that should be heard. Doesn't mean I have to believe everything they say, but they deserve respect, and they have a reason for feeling the way that they do. And trying to understand that is just as important as identifying the facts that maybe led up to some event that person was involved in.
That's good.
Yeah, I was just curious too, along the lines of, it seems like we keep hearing more and more about, like, you don't have 4 minutes to tell the story, it needs to be done in a minute 30, just because as time's been going on, we're saying attention spans are shorter. But you guys all seem to be touching on the idea that there's a misunderstanding for people because we don't get deep enough into the issue telling the 5 or 6 sides. Is there something we can do better, in your guys' opinion, as media professionals, to get a deeper understanding but still be catering to that necessity that people don't pay attention to it for as long an amount of time?
That's a great question, because that is a reality of what we do too in broadcast journalism. You only have so much time that you can tell the story. So I think what it entails is having as great of understanding as you can of what the story is as a reporter. And in your mind, trying to streamline what are the most important pieces of information, what are the most important characters that need to be in the story. How can I most effectively tell the story given my visuals and my different people that I've interviewed, my facts that I have? And I think you can boil it down in a shorter period of time. I mean, sometimes you do have to condense it. I have done long investigations that I've had literally months to work on, and I've read through hundreds of pages of documents. I maybe have interviewed a dozen people for my story, and all of that information and all of those voices don't always end up in the story, but having more information still is better than having a limited amount of information that would just fit in my story, because it helps me to have the perspective to make sure that my story is all-encompassing, even if I only have a short time to tell it. Does that make sense?
I think that's the conversation we have in our editorial meeting every day is how do we cover it? What platforms do we use? How much time do we dedicate? Which stories do we dedicate a reporter? And that's the new news landscape is so diverse now that some people who like really long form written pieces, we have to do those here on the web. Other people just like a little snippet, a little short video. So we're trying to meet people where they are, and everybody sort of consumes news in a different way. And it's our job, though, to preserve the integrity of the original story, regardless of it's 15 minutes or 20 seconds.
And I would just encourage everyone in this room to spread the gospel of news literacy. And by that I mean, don't just rely on one source. Be curious. Read if someone discards a newspaper that you've never seen before, pick it up, read it. Use whatever resources the library here has to gain lots of information, and encourage people in your life to do the same thing, because there's a lot of great stuff out there.
And one other thing I might just add on that I think is important is like, it can be overwhelming because you're like, oh my gosh, now I have to include so much more in my stories, and how am I going to? Don't think of it that way. Sometimes your story, you can focus on a much smaller element of an issue. It doesn't have to be all inclusive in one story. You can have one voice in your story. You can just showcase one person's experience that demonstrates the impact of Obamacare in their life, whether good or bad. But it's showing a truth of that issue, and presenting their story can have a huge impact in helping people understand how that policy is affecting people in everyday life. So not every story has to be like the whole apple pie. Sometimes you just need a slice.
Let me just throw one more thing on that. I mean, we've been telling stories for millions of years. Our ancestors, we're built to tell stories. And it's what Anna said. We tell stories so that we can experience what other people are feeling. Some stories make us laugh, some stories make us cry, but at the end of the day, we're better human beings if we're at a place of better understanding, because that's what this is all about. So, and that's the takeaway as a journalist. I mean, that's sort of my benchmark. Are we better for having heard the story, having read the story? It could just be walk a mile in my shoes. And just to understand that is valuable, I think.
I think we're going to have to call it quits here, but maybe the panelists will take more questions after. But I want to thank Ana Cabrera, Mark Wright, and Russ Walker. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the good questions. And I think like one of the keys of being successful in journalism is just that, is to stay curious. And my dad used to tell me every day when I was in school, like in elementary school even, ask good questions. And that has like stuck with me to the core. It never hurts to ask questions, never think there's a stupid question. And as a journalist, there's definitely no stupid question.
And think before retweeting or liking. Pause, then. I liked it when you said that.
Yeah, likewise, guys.